Hello, Google Boston. It's nice to be here. Yes, I am in town promoting my new book, The End of the World, and a very scary seagull on the cover. And this is a weird one, The Belly of the Beast for me. I'm a long-credentialed tech critic, going back certainly in print to 1995. I've been hard on Silicon Valley, hard on some of the dopey utopianism, trying to call attention to the intimate connection from the beginning of the commercial internet between consumerism and tech. And there is some stuff about tech in the new book, not so much in this book as in some of the previous books, but I'm going to mostly focus on some of the other preoccupations in these new essays. I'm going to read a piece of one of them, but maybe first say that it's a bit of a, I was thinking on the way over here, you know, they're the big five, and you guys are part of one of the big five, and it's been interesting to trace, almost as a parlor game, which of the five at any moment in time has seemed to me the most evil. For a long time, because there weren't five, there was really only Microsoft, there was no contest. I was a DOS user, and then a early Windows hater, and there was much to dislike about Bill Gates's company. But then others quickly moved in, beginning with Apple. Apple was for a long time easily at the top of my most hated list because of its not so veiled contempt for its passionate fans. To me, the absence of a delete key on the keyboard, on the famous Apple keyboard, is one striking example, and I will not say more, but if you're an actual writer, having a backspace key and a delete key, it's a plus, believe me. You don't need to reposition the cursor. You just hit delete. Sucks that character right up from the right. It's nice. You would think a large company in the business of helping academics and writers might appreciate that, but apparently, it went straight to Steve Jobs, and he said, no, the keyboard is prettier without that. So that was hateable. And then there was that wonderful series of ads, and I actually came to like Microsoft because it wasn't Apple, and Microsoft was embodied by the John Hodgman character in that wonderful series of ads. John Hodgman, totally lovable, embodying everything that had become weirdly lovable about the formerly hated Microsoft. And what's his face? Justin?
Justin Long.
Justin Long, yes. I'm sure he's a nice guy. But so then, and I still, my little tag at the bottom of my Android Gmail account showing that it was sent from a device is still sent from a non-Apple device, because it seemed very important always to be stressing that. But then Amazon and Facebook. Amazon, one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse as far as the book industry and the bookstores are concerned. Of course, it's gone beyond that to become a textbook monopoly, behaving in textbook monopoly fashion. And I think it really occupied number one on the most hated list for many years. And it still contends for that spot. But Facebook. I'm not mentioning Twitter because it's not one of the big five, and because it's not even clear that it's worth hating. It seems to me more like one of those RNA viruses that does unspeakable harm, but people are not even sure if it's a life form. Whereas Facebook is clearly a life form, also scarcely behind Amazon and its monopolistic intentions and its monopolistic behavior. And what seems really particularly evil about it, I mean, Bezos knows what he's doing. He knows it's bad, but he kind of owns up to it. It's not like he's hiding the fact that he wants to control all consumer commerce everywhere in the world. Whereas Facebook still wraps it up in these gauzy phrases and seems just weirdly immune to all of the harm that it's causing with its incredibly addictive product, its incredibly addictive, surveillant, civil discourse destroying product. So where's Google in all of this? I asked myself, riding the old red line over here from Harvard Square. I lived in Somerville for 5 years. I wrote my first novel while I was on the strength of a research position I had at Harvard in the seismology lab there. I lived in Somerville for 5 years, and I am not sure I'd been on a red line train since I left in 1987. So it was weird. It seemed completely unchanged. The buskers at the Harvard Street station were identical. The trains looked identical. It all seemed sort of sadly small compared to New York. That was identical too. Sweetly identical now. At the time it was sad, even infuriatingly small. That's why I moved to New York. Anyway, I was thinking, why don't I hate Google as much as I hate Facebook and Amazon and even Apple? A large part of it is because I really like some of your products. I am on Gmail and it's good. I wish someone maybe afterwards could explain to me how to get on my Android device my emails not to display in thread form, so that when you delete one, you don't delete the whole thread. Maybe someone has some expertise and can help me configure that. I searched and searched all the settings, can't find it. Anyway, but apart from that, great product. I use your search engine. I use Google Maps. It's all very good. One could argue that Google's position on copyright for a writer ought to give one pause, but I kind of outsource that outrage to the Authors Guild that I'm a proud member of and let it file the complaints and even lawsuits to try to protect poor writers from the ever-widening net sweeping up copyrighted material and offering it without compensation to those writers. So that's, it's a small thing. But then...
Sorry to interrupt, that's really not fair. That's not an accurate characterization.
Okay, I know. I'm here to give you the view, how you are seen in the writers' community. It's true. That's, and indeed, this is in the context of saying I don't hate Google like I hate the others, because I find all sorts of stuff with the Google search engine, books that I would otherwise not be able to access, and it'll take me to the keyword on page 267 of some obscure text that was published in 1953 or 1927. Fantastic. So I think we can actually come to some reasonable accommodation. I do know that the Authors Guild has had some issues with Google. But it's true, I did, in my not so accustomed to public speaking way, perhaps overstate the case. Anyway, I was thinking yesterday, as I came in on the plane, I travel with stacks of New Yorkers that I don't get around to reading at home because I can throw them away. And my bag gets lighter and lighter as I travel. And I happened to be reading about Google as I was landing in Boston last night. Is it Lewandowski, that case, the Waymo thing? And boy, does he sound like not a great guy. And it didn't really, it didn't affect the standings at all, that piece. It was a little hard on Google and Waymo. But I was thinking about the whole notion of the self-driving car. The piece ends with this wonderful quote from Lewandowski talking about how uninteresting history is, how the only thing that matters, at least to someone in tech like him, is the future. And I was thinking about the self-driving car thing, which has always bugged me a little bit. You make a list of problems we have as a country, as a world, and I struggle to imagine that anyone on their top 25 problems to be solved list has need to sit behind the wheel while I listen to podcasts in traffic rather than sitting in the passenger seat listening to podcasts in traffic. Has always seemed to me that perhaps the self-driving car initiative has underestimated the extent to which people actually enjoy driving. For Americans particularly, it's an expression of personal freedom. In some ways, for non-gun owners, it's the expression of personal freedom. And then as I was taking a cab, an old-fashioned cab, not an Uber, from Logan last night, because I think of the poor cabbies and like to support them, even though it would probably have been cheaper to take Uber or Lyft. I was thinking about a problem that's on everyone's list, that a lot of the tech oligarchs seem suddenly very, very preoccupied with, and that's the problem of dying. I think we can all agree that remains a big problem for any human being. You're going to die. And it's a measure of you want to know why people like me hold Silicon Valley in such low esteem, and why I personally have watched all of the show Silicon Valley at least twice, every episode at least twice, if not 3 times or 4 times, and think it's one of the most profound cultural products of the last 8 years. It has to do with this notion that tech is going to solve the problem of death. And as we were whisking in, wonderful now to live in 2018 thanks to the big dig, how quickly you can get to your hotel. It used to be an adventure to get to Logan when I lived here, before many of you were born. I was imagining being 635 years old and wondering what I was going to do this week, and thinking maybe I will rewatch all 7,000 episodes of The Simpsons. I haven't done that since I did it as a special birthday treat to myself the year I turned 500. And it had been, like a couple of 100 years since I'd watched even one episode of The Simpsons before then. So it's like, I'm fresh. It's been 135 years since I watched all 7,000 episodes. And I've got plenty of time because I'm never going to die. And also my options for what I'm going to do with myself otherwise are rather limited, because of course I can't go outside. Because what if some freakish accident happened and an enormous chunk of masonry or a large tree fell on me and obliterated 635 years worth of living, so damaged me that I couldn't be put back together. So basically I have to wear these padded clothes and this big spongy helmet for fear that something might happen to me, because now I'm 635 years and I can live forever thanks to technology. But I have to be very, very careful. And also, for the first 480 years of my life, there was the risk that when I would go outdoors, I might run into a mortal person, somebody who didn't have as much money as I did, and who was understandably resentful that some people who had a lot of money and could afford it could be immortal, but they were not. And that had become such a problem with the rage of mortal people against the wealthy immortal people that finally the decision had sadly been taken to exterminate all moral people. So that left just us immortals, but we're still pretty bunkered down because of the risk of physical harm. And, what do? You get married 30 times before you're even 600 years old. You keep your eye on that cute little 180-year-old down the hall, one of the last people ever born, very, very attractive to many of us older people. And you know that in the fullness of time, because you'll live forever, you'll be able to marry that cute little person down the hall and then divorce that person. I've gone on too long about this silly scenario. I'm not a sci-fi writer, and I'm sure sci-fi writers have roasted the whole concept much more than I. I'm not considering the possibility that our minds can be downloaded and exist in eternal form in digital form. I could go into that if I had prepared more than riding the subway over here. The inextricable, the inextricability of identity from bodily self. It's merely to say that the whole idea of living forever doesn't pass the most rudimentary moral examination. And you have to think that the tech billionaire who's deciding to put $100 or $200 million into investigating the possibility of living forever is either unbelievably morally stupid or worse, like the worst kind of asshole, imagining that, well, other people have to die, but I don't have to die. And that's kind of the definition of an asshole. So there's a gulf. I've taken an extreme example, but there's a gulf between the way, say, literature considers the problem of death and the way problem solvers consider the problem of death. Literature doesn't think it's a solvable problem. Much changes when you acknowledge that certain problems aren't solvable. The people are actually not very nice. That was the great mistake that the visionaries made in the 90s. They were all nice guys, and most of the people in the early days of Facebook, they were all well-educated, clean, happy white people with liberal politics. What could the problem be? Well, the problem is that people aren't very good. People are at least as bad as they're good. This is not actually a solvable problem any more than death is. So the approach I'm arguing here of literature is to accept the insolubility of problems and say, well, then what then? I'm going to die. How do I position myself in relation to that? You start thinking about the fact, well, people I love are going to die too. In fact, everyone's going to die. Certain things fall out that are actually very positive in terms of how you lead your life in the moment and how you treat other people when you accept the reality and the insolubility of a problem. I began by saying that most of the book is not about this stuff. A lot of it is about nature and climate change. And I'm going to read some pages from an essay called The Essay in Dark Times. Everything I ever write is arguing for literature. Even when I'm writing about birds, I'm arguing for literature in the way I write about birds. Books are what I most care about. Okay, so I've just disrupted myself. Where was I? Okay, I'm just going to launch in, and hopefully I can make this comprehensible. I'm starting right in the middle of an essay. When I came home from Africa, where I'd been bird watching, to Santa Cruz, this was 2 years ago exactly, my progressive friends were still struggling to understand how Trump could have won. I remembered a public event I'd once done with the optimistic social media specialist Clay Shirky, who'd recounted to the audience how shocked professional New York restaurant critics had been when Zagat, a crowdsourced reviewing service, had named Union Square Cafe the best restaurant in town. Shirky's point was the professional critics aren't as smart as they think they are, that, in fact, in the age of big data, critics are no longer even necessary. At the event, ignoring the fact that Union Square Cafe was my favorite New York restaurant, the crowd was right, I'd sourly wondered if Shirky believed that critics were also stupid to consider Alice Munro a better writer than James Patterson. But now Trump's victory, too, had vindicated Shirky's mockery of the pundits. Social media had allowed Trump to bypass the critical establishment, and just enough members of the crowd in key swing states had found his low comedy and his incendiary speech better than Clinton's nuanced arguments and her mastery of policy. This follows from that. Without Twitter and Facebook, no Trump. After the election, Mark Zuckerberg did briefly seem to take responsibility, sort of, for having created the platform of choice for fake news about Clinton, and to suggest that Facebook could become more active in filtering the news. Good luck with that. Twitter, for its part, kept its head down as Trump's tweeting continued unabated. What could Twitter possibly say? That it was making the world a better place? In December, my favorite Santa Cruz radio station, KPIG, began running a fake ad offering counseling services to addicts of Trump-hating tweets and Facebook posts. The following month, a week before Trump's inauguration, the Pan American Center organized events around the country to reject the assault on free speech that it claimed Trump represented. Although his administration's travel restrictions did later make it harder for writers from Muslim countries to have their voices heard in the United States, and although he did still later kick Costa out of the press corps, the one bad thing that could not be said of Trump in January was that he had in any way curtailed free speech. His lying, bullying tweets were free speech on steroids. Penn itself, just a few years earlier, had given a free speech award to Twitter for its self-publicized role in the Arab Spring. The actual result of the Arab Spring had been a retrenchment of autocracy, and Twitter had since revealed itself in Trump's hands to be a platform made to order for autocracy. But the ironies didn't end there. During the same week in January, progressive American bookstores and authors proposed a boycott of Simon & Schuster for the crime of intending to publish one book by the dismal right-wing provocateur Milo Yiannopoulos. The angriest of the bookstores talked of refusing to stock all titles from S&S, including, presumably, the books of Andrew Solomon, the president of Penn. The talk didn't end until S&S voided its contract with Yiannopoulos. Trump and his alt-right supporters take pleasure in pushing the buttons of the politically correct, but it only works because the buttons are there to be pushed. Students and activists claiming the right to not hear things that upset them and to shout down ideas that offend them. Intolerance particularly flourishes online, where measured speech is punished by not getting clicked on. Invisible Facebook and Google algorithms steer you toward content you agree with, and non-conforming voices stay silent for fear of being flamed or trolled or unfriended. The result is a silo in which, whatever side you're on, you feel absolutely right to hate what you hate. And here is another way in which the essay differs from superficially similar kinds of subjective speech. The essay's roots are in literature, and literature at its best, the work of Alice Munro, for example, invites you to ask whether you might be somewhat wrong, maybe entirely wrong, and to imagine why someone else might hate you. I'm going to pause just to say that I wrote this a year and a half ago, and it already feels like what I was saying then, which seemed urgent and somewhat fresh, now a lot of people are saying, which has been very heartening, particularly the scrutiny of Facebook that has unfolded in the past 18 months has been very, very heartening. People are starting to get it, as far as I can see. Three years ago, I was in a state of rage about climate change. The Republican Party was continuing to lie about the absence of a scientific consensus on climate. Florida's Department of Environmental Protection had gone so far as to forbid its employees to write the words climate change after the governor, now involved in an interesting ballot recount, insisted that it wasn't a true fact. But I wasn't much less angry at the left. I'd read a new book by Naomi Klein, This Changes Everything, in which she'd assured the reader that although time is tight, we still have 10 years to radically remake the global economy and prevent global temperatures from rising by more than 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. Klein's optimism was touching, but it too was a kind of denialism. Even before the election of Donald Trump, there was no evidence to suggest that humanity is capable, politically, psychologically, ethically, economically, of slashing carbon emissions quickly and deeply enough to change everything. Even the European Union, which had taken the early lead on climate and was fond of lecturing other regions on their irresponsibility, needed only a recession in 2009 to shift its focus to economic growth. Barring a worldwide revolt against free market capitalism in the next 10 years, the scenario that Klein contended could still save us, the most likely rise in temperature this century is on the order of 6 degrees Celsius. We'll be lucky to avoid a 2-degree rise before the year 2030. Again, the new report in October, starting to get it. But this was 3 years ago, now actually 4 years ago. In a polity ever more starkly divided, the truth about global warming was even less convenient to the left than to the right. The right's denials were odious lies, but at least they were consistent with a certain cold-eyed political realism. The left, having excoriated the right for its intellectual dishonesty and turned climate denialism into a political rallying cry, was now in an impossible position. The left had to keep insisting on the truth of climate science while persisting in the fiction that collective world action could stave off the worst of it. That universal acceptance of the facts, which really might have changed everything in 1995, could still change everything. Otherwise, what difference did it make if the Republicans quibbled with the science? Because my sympathies were with the left, reducing carbon emissions is vastly better than doing nothing. Every half degree helps. I also held it to a higher standard. Denying the dark reality, pretending that the Paris Accord could avert catastrophe, was understandable as a tactic to keep people motivated to reduce emissions, to keep hope alive. As a strategy, though, it did more harm than good. It ceded the ethical high ground, insulted the intelligence of unpersuaded voters. Really? We still have 10 years? And precluded frank discussion of how the global community should prepare for drastic changes, and how nations like Bangladesh should be compensated for what nations like the United States have done to them. Now we get to one of my main points in this book. Dishonesty also skewed priorities. In the past 20 years, the environmental movement had become captive to a single issue. Partly out of genuine alarm, partly also because foregrounding human problems was politically less risky, less elitist, than talking about nature. The big environmental NGOs had all invested their political capital in fighting climate change, a problem with a human face. The NGO that particularly enraged me as a bird lover was the National Audubon Society, once an uncompromising defender of birds, now a lethargic institution with a very large PR department. In September 2014, with much fanfare, that PR department had announced to the world that climate change was the #1 threat to the birds of North America. The announcement was both narrowly dishonest, because its wording didn't square with the conclusions of Audubon's own scientists, and broadly dishonest, because not one single bird death could be directly attributed to human carbon emissions. In 2014, the most serious threats to American birds were habitat loss and outdoor cats. By invoking the buzzword of climate change, Audubon got a lot of attention in the liberal media. Another point had been scored against the science-denying right. But it was not at all clear how this helped birds. The only practical effect of Audubon's announcement, it seemed to me, was to discourage people from addressing the real threats to nature in the present. I was so angry that I decided I'd better write an essay. I began with a Jeremiad against the National Audubon Society, broadened it into a scornful denunciation of the environmental movement generally, and then started waking up in the night in a panic of remorse and doubt. For the writer, an essay is a mirror, and I didn't like what I was seeing in this one. Why was I excoriating fellow liberals when the denialists were so much worse? The prospect of climate change was every bit as sickening to me as to the groups I was attacking. With every additional degree of global warming, further hundreds of millions of people around the world would suffer. Wasn't it worth an all-out effort to achieve a reduction of even half of 1 degree? Wasn't it obscene to be talking about birds when children in Bangladesh were threatened? Yes, the premise of my essay was that we have an ethical responsibility to other species as well as to our own. But what if that premise was false? And even if it was true, did I really care personally about biodiversity? Or was I just a privileged white guy who liked to go birding? And not even a pure-hearted birder, a lister. After 3 nights of doubting my character and motives, I called my New Yorker editor, Henry Finder, and told him I couldn't write the piece. I'd done plenty of ranting about climate to my friends and to like-minded conservationists, but it was a lot like the ranting that happens online, where you're protected by the impromptu nature of the writing and by the known friendliness of your audience. Trying to write a finished thing, an essay, had made me aware of the sloppiness of my thinking. It had also enormously increased the risk of shame, because the writing wasn't casual, and because it was going out to an audience of probably hostile strangers. Following Henry's admonition, I'd come to think of the essayist as a firefighter, whose job, while everyone else is fleeing the flames of shame, is to run straight into them. But I had a lot more to fear now than my mother's disapproval. Sorry, that's going over your head. The first time I risked shame in an essay, my mother didn't speak to me for a month. My essay might have stayed abandoned if I hadn't already clicked a button on Audubon's website affirming that yes, I wanted to join it in fighting climate change. I'd only done this to gather rhetorical ammunition to use against Audubon, but a deluge of direct mail solicitations had followed from that click. I got at least 8 of them in 6 weeks, all of them asking me to give money, along with a similar deluge in my email inbox. A few days after speaking to Henry, I opened one of the emails and found myself looking at a picture of myself. Luckily, a flattering image, taken in 2010 for Vogue magazine, which had dressed me up better than I dressed myself and posed me in a field with my binoculars like a birder. The headline of the email was something like, "Join author Jonathan Franzen in supporting Audubon." It was true that a few years earlier in an interview with Audubon magazine, I'd politely praised the organization, or at least its magazine, but no one had asked for my permission to use my name and image for solicitation. I wasn't sure the email was even legal. They're bad, they're really bad. A more benign impetus to return to the essay came from Henry. As far as I know, Henry couldn't care less about birds, but he seemed to see something in my argument that our preoccupation with future catastrophes discourages us from tackling solvable environmental problems in the here and now. In an email to me, he gently suggested that I lose the tone of prophetic scorn. "This piece will be more persuasive," he wrote in another, "if, ironically, it's more ambivalent, less polemical. You're not wailing on folks who want us to pay attention to climate change and emissions reductions, but you're attentive to the costs, to what the discourse pushes to the margins." Email by email, revision by revision, Henry nudged me toward framing the essay not as a denunciation, but as a question. How do we find meaning in our actions when the world seems to be coming to an end? Much of the final draft was devoted to a pair of well-conceived regional conservation projects in Peru and Costa Rica, where the world really is being made a better place, not just for wild plants and wild animals, but for the Peruvians and Costa Ricans who live there. Work on these projects is personally meaningful, and the benefits are immediate and tangible. In writing about the 2 projects, I hope that 1 or 2 of the big charitable foundations, the ones spending tens of millions of dollars on biodiesel development or on wind farms in Eritrea, might read the piece and consider investing in work that produces results. What I got instead was a missile attack from the liberal silo. I'm not on social media, but my friends reported that I was being called all sorts of names, including bird brain and climate change denier. Tweet-sized snippets of my essay retweeted out of context made it sound as if I proposed that we abandon the effort to reduce carbon emissions, which was the position of the Republican Party, which, by the polarizing logic of online discourse, made me a climate change denier. In fact, I'm such a climate science acceptor that I don't even bother having hope for the ice caps. All I denied was that a right-thinking international elite meeting in nice hotels around the world could stop them from melting. This was my crime against orthodoxy. Climate now has such a lock on the liberal imagination that any attempt to change the conversation, even trying to change it to the epic extinction event that human beings are already creating without the help of climate change, amounts to an offense against religion. It's 20 of 2. I'm going to stop there. The essay goes on. Hopefully that was a suspenseful point to stop. I'd be happy to take any questions you might have. Thank you very much for listening to me this rainy afternoon.
Thank you very much. I have two questions, actually, and apologies if I didn't quite understand some of the points that you made. My first question is, given that and probably I'm speaking on behalf of the liberal orthodoxy here, but given that, as you well know, the climate catastrophe is going to destroy all before it, at some level, what is the point of focusing even on sixth mass extinction level events, given that anything that is preserved is not likely to last more than a couple of decades anyway? And
let's have it back and forth. I'll do that one, and then you can, if you remember your question, I'll go to the next one. The short answer is, I know my spouse equivalent, Kathy, is going to die. What's the point in doing anything with her? What's the point in trying to help her in any way, given that she's going to die pretty soon? It's all going to be over. Why would I? At a certain level, the question doesn't compute. It's because things I love right in front of me are in trouble. I love them. I want to help them. And yes, I know it's going to be tough for a lot of them, although birds are shockingly resilient, and there's some recent new evidence from studying California showing incredibly quick adaptation in terms of when they start their breeding cycle to a warming climate. But that's not even, it doesn't even matter. It's like, what the meaning in my life comes from spending time with Kathy and being around things I love and trying to help them. So
I guess it does at some level come down to a question of values, in the sense that if your spouse equivalent were going to, I would not take an action to prolong her life by a minute or two. I guess I would look at the question of surviving extinctions as best measured in geologic time, where it sounds like you're looking at it at a human time scale.
Well, yeah, in terms of meaning in what I do with my life, I have no choice but to view it at a human time scale. The thing is, we don't know what the future holds exactly. We do know is that if we let the extinction event unfold, there will not be anything. All this, we will have so radically destroyed the fabric of the natural world as we were bequeathed it, that, you know, then someone's coming along with a blowtorch after we've already completely killed it. So, but weird things happen. I mean, maybe the geoengineers will fix things. Maybe some, even if it's a relatively small fraction of the species that make up what we call biodiversity, even manage to adapt, evolve. It's like the more we've got to start with, the better chance everyone has. So I don't see that as necessarily. I can also think in a geological scale as well about it, which is, let's separate in our mind what we're doing to the planet. On the one hand, we're destroying the last remaining ecosystems. On the other hand, we're doing this huge additional thing that is going to make everything really, really, really terrible. But it's not that those are actually two different things we're doing. And I'm saying one of them is something, and the latter, the more terrible one, is something that we apparently, by all appearances, can't do anything about. The former, well, in fact, there are some very concrete things we can do still.
I see. Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. My second question, you mentioned just now that the latter is something that we can't do anything about. And earlier in your talk, you spoke a little bit disparagingly of the notion that society might have a all-out effort to reduce the warming by, say, 0.5 degrees Celsius. I'm curious, to what extent do you see climate change as a binary, yes, the catastrophe happens, or no, it doesn't? And to what extent do you see value in reducing, by some small amount, the scope of the catastrophe?
Oh, and the camera's rolling, and so I really kind of hate to admit that I don't think there's an appreciable difference between 5.5 and 6 by the year 2100.
Do you see an appreciable difference in 800 million people dying and 801 million people dying?
Yes, of course. Yes. And if there was some way to imagine that collective action could be taken on the part of countries of the world now and their populations to save those even 1 million lives, I would be all for doing it. There are, of course, other stakeholders. And you get into these kind of, the question's a little bit like, well, if here's the last pair of elephants on Earth, and here is a human child, would you let the baby die in order to save the elephant species? It's like, you can set these things up and like, well, who wants to admit that they would kill a human child in order to save some non-human species? It's the whole structure of that kind of question is morally upsetting, and but what exactly is your question?
My question is whether it sounds to me like you don't see any moral value in reducing the scope of the catastrophe. Is that a correct understanding of what you are arguing?
No, I absolutely do. If I thought we could really, if we could prevent Bangladesh from being submerged, if there were some, like, even if it was a narrow path to achieving that, I would say we should absolutely take that path.
Would you support, and I recognize I'm going on for a long time, would you support a path which would reduce by 10% the fraction of Bangladesh that is going to be submerged?
That gets us back into the would you save one child situation. The real answer to your question is that 5.5, when it comes to radical destabilization of everything we consider civilization, and certainly everything we consider liberal democracy and human rights and rule of law, you're so far past the point where it all breaks down that, because remember, it's people, there will be increasing numbers of people who die simply from being too hot. So there is a direct, summers will be hotter, especially in places like India and Africa. People will simply die of the heat. But most of the catastrophe we're facing is a compounding thing, where frequency of climatic events, extreme climatic events, drought, water crises, all of this begin to combine with a political situation which is deteriorating. And then you throw some gas in the flames in terms of what technology is doing to break down the ability of people to actually speak to one another civilly and come to some sort of agreement even about basic facts. And the thing just, it looks like what we've got now, this lovely world here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, it's just really hard to see how that stands up, whether it's 5.5 or 6 degrees warming by the end of the century. Sorry to be a bummer about it, but that's very good questions. I appreciate the opportunity to clarify.
Let's move to literature. Maybe it's less of an issue.
All has a question.
Yeah.
That's what you're saying.
Yeah. In one of your essays, you mourn the fact that readers think and judge characters in books in terms of likability, how they like them. I was wondering, how do you feel about readers that focus on assessing the morality of characters? And furthermore, as a writer, are you concerned with how readers can assess the morality of your characters in an ever-changing world where the morality changed so quickly, where one character may seem to be quite all right, but after a few years, you say, oh no, he's completely immoral, he must be distant from or even banned completely?
Yeah, I'm a little impatient with those moral judgments. I think people who go into the business of writing literary fiction tend to be at odds with people who are morally sure of themselves. It's not quite an entry-level qualification for being a good novelist, but it's nearly one, that you begin with the presumption that you don't know what's right, and probably that what other people consider right and wrong needs some examination. It's interesting. I take your question to partly be pointing in a little larger time scale toward the difference in the way we read people from the late 19th century. Joseph Conrad, who was a early and powerful critic of colonialism. That's how I remember Nostromo. It's just like this wipeout attack on European colonialism in South America. I went back and I reread Victory, which had been the novel of his I admired most after Nostromo, last summer, and it was like, oh, dude, you're such a racist. You're such a sexist. You don't understand women at all. Oh my God, don't do that. And that's and the question is, was that always there? Because there are older writers than that. You go back to Shakespeare, pick up Macbeth, and I have no problem with Shakespeare. Yes, there's anti-Semitism to be found, and certain other somewhat deplorable political aspects of Shakespeare. By and large, he's okay. Tolstoy's okay. Most of the women fare much better, although not all of them. And to take a more recent example, a lot of the writing that was so popular and so critically privileged in the 60s, I think Catch-22. Catch-22 was this enormous book for me, Joseph Heller. It was my model for what I wanted to do with my novels. It's like he was telling this crazy story, it was funny, and it was line by line wonderful, and it was inventive, and it actually seemed to do something to change the world. It was part of the cresting of the anti-Vietnam War movement in the late 60s and early 70s. Everybody was reading Catch-22. That was my model of a book. I go back and it's like, oh, dude, so sexist. Like, would it have killed you to do one female character with her own subjectivity? Apparently, yes. Not doable. And Pynchon was the same way. It's really, actually, even at the time, I knew Pynchon was that way. When I was reading Gravity's Rainbow as a feminist in 1981, it was like, but there's other work from the same time that doesn't do that, which gets into an argument I make in this book, which is that character is not just characters on the page, but there's also the character of the writer. And I think the stuff that holds up well is when the writer has good character, basically. And you can make mistakes, and yes, certain cultural assumptions, there are kinds, everyone was so racist in the 19th century and before. Like, there's just no way that that it's almost impossible to find a writer who's completely free of it, because there was no penalty to be paid for letting those attitudes show. And yet, within that spectrum, some people you can say, that person had a big soul, a big heart, and that person, a bit of an asshole. Anyway, there was a sort of, like you're at an auction nod from gentleman back.
Curious how you got into birding.
I got into birding. Oh, it was like any religious experience. I was converted by some friends. And there was kind of a Paul on the road to Damascus moment for me, and that was seeing a veery in Central Park. I'd never heard of veeries. There were 100,000 people in the park. It was a beautiful May day, and here's this bird, utterly lovely, and one of the first times I've ever had binoculars in my hand. I'm looking at it, it's like, wow, that's a beautiful thing, and it's surrounded by people, and what is this? No one ever told me. So, yeah, it was people taking me out, putting binoculars in my hands. It had been growing for a while, but that was the main thing.
Being here at Google, you kind of led us into something that I've asked myself here, working here, and that is, what would your priorities for technology be? Do you have a vision for how could a company with a big social reach help foster the kind of society that we want to live in? How do we connect people without spreading, this ability to for the platform to be misused by people who are spreading misinformation? I mean, it turns out from what I see, it's a technologically difficult problem to solve.
It absolutely is. I'd like to mostly slip away with a promise to go home and think about that, because I've been such a tech critic for so long, and not even a particularly well-informed one, just a kind of intuitive one, which gets me into trouble when I overstate my case. But it's true that I perhaps don't think enough about what I wish it would look like. There are so many, first of all, let's talk about, there's so many great things that you guys do in terms of access to information, access to products. I'm not a buying guy, I'm not a consumer, but every once in a while there's something hard to find that I would like to find, and Kathy, my spouse equivalent, had some old dinner plates, and they were getting chipped, and we really liked them, and she got them at Pier 1 like in 1992. And, sure enough, eBay, there they were. I had to go through like 4 different sellers, but I was able to assemble this, like what turned out to be, I'm not sure she liked it, but I thought it was a terrific birthday present for her, for a big birthday she just had. And small thing, what it's doing just in terms of accelerating certain kinds of science, particularly science with citizen participation, it's fantastic. I think email is a superior form of communication. I know it's gotten out of hand, but could go on and on and on. I don't deny the blessings that tech brings us. I feel as if policy-wise, one of the biggest problems we face is that the DNA of Silicon Valley is so anti-regulation. It really comes out of a sort of 60s and 70s hippie distrust of the government, and that has morphed in many cases into something closer to a right-wing libertarianism. But there's such hostility to government, such deep distrust of government, even as, in terms of power reach, influence, and wealth, the industry has begun to rival the government in surveillance power and in power to shape public opinion. Still, that there's such a deep distrust of government that it's just almost unthinkable to ask to be regulated. But something like Facebook, to me, cries out for regulation. And something like Amazon cries out for quick antitrust work on the part of the Justice Department. There are things that I think should happen, and even though, but what it's so there's, on the one hand, the part of the problem is like in your bones resistance to any form of government intervention and distrust of government, but also almost anything done to impede what's happening now is going to have an effect on profits. And Sherry Turkle talks about something that has begun to be discussed a little bit in the social media world, building in features that encourage people to disconnect rather than to addictively stay connected 60 hours a week. Laughable idea, because why would you want to reduce the stream of data that your users are providing as they remain online, and yet even from like a public health standpoint, especially for children, it seems like you have to start doing that, but it's going to cost. And that's really, that to me is the real issue, is that that Silicon Valley has become a shareholder-serving operation. And as long as, so it's hard for me to, I'm not even sure I would want this, but it's hard for me to imagine really radical change without something like nationalization, where it's this like public ownership of at least 2 or 3 of the big 5, treat them as public utilities, and yeah, okay, and now there are going to be certain rules, and yes, there's not going to be as much money, there's also not going to be as much surveillance, and so forth. So maybe and I am going to stop after uttering this sentence. I think there are many ways in which tech is already a force for good, in that it is fundamentally an information business. And information, if it's handled right and used appropriately, is a very powerful and wonderful thing. And that the main obstacle to it becoming a true force for good is that profit motive. Thank you very much.